The refugee standoff between Belarus and the European Union escalates. It's the latest example of the UN's Refugee Convention under strain. So, do we need a new international agreement to ensure better protection for migrants and refugees? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Belarus and the EU are raising their stakes in the standoff over refugees and migrants. The EU is imposing more sanctions on entities in Belarus. It accuses President Alexander Lukashenko of encouraging undocumented migrants to cross into Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. In response, Lukashenko is threatening to cut off gas supplies to Europe. Poland has asked NATO to take concrete steps to resolve the crisis. Thousands of refugees are stuck in the middle of the political row. They've spent weeks at the border, sleeping in camps in freezing temperatures. Many have been denied basic protection, such as housing and medical care. The UN is urging all sides to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law.
We not sleep because of cold, and her baby is sick. Her eyes have problem, always out water her baby. Because she can't sleep, she's crying because of that.
This has been the most tiring 2 months of my life. We even fell into a pond. Water reached up to here. I fell and we didn't have clothes. Then I got sick. When the border guards found us, I couldn't even stand by myself.
The Belarus-EU standoff is just one example of how international refugee and migrant protections are under strain. Italy and Spain have forced migrant boats back to North Africa. The United States has tried to stop record numbers of Central American migrants crossing its southern border. And for 20 years, Australia has kept refugees and asylum seekers in offshore prisons in Papua New Guinea and Nauru. The UN Refugee Convention was drawn up 70 years ago in the shadow of World War II. It lays out states' obligations towards refugees. An additional protocol in 1967 broadened the scope of those who can seek protection. Signatories have a legal duty to protect those fleeing persecution and serious harm. This includes that they can't be returned to a place where they felt in danger or be denied safe shelter. It also says a state shouldn't stop them entering. 149 countries have ratified the convention, the protocol, or both. In 2018, the UN introduced a new international agreement known as the Global Compact on Refugees to better protect refugees and migrants. It's not legally binding, but commits signatories to improving cooperation on international migration. All right, let's bring in our guests. In Geneva, Shabia Mantoo, spokesperson for the UN Refugee Agency. In Oxford, Nando, Sigona, professor of international migration and forced displacement at University of Birmingham. And in Cambridge, Marianna Karakoulaki, a researcher and journalist focusing on refugees in Greece. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us today on Inside Story. Shabia, let me start with you today. There are those who say that the Refugee Convention, which is 70 years old, is falling short of its mission, that it is under too much strain. Could a new international agreement ensure better protection for migrants and refugees going forward?
We're seeing 70 years of a Refugee Convention. It's been 70 years of saving lives. So this instrument is actually one of the greatest human rights instruments to have ever been developed. It saved millions of lives across the world for the past few decades. Its core principles are universal. They're as relevant as ever. On the basis of this, people can access safety and protection. The people fleeing conflict, persecution, human rights violations. So the coverage that it extends and the protections that it affords to people, these are timeless, universal principles that have been codified. There's not an element of the convention that is outdated because this is really life-saving at its core. But the real test and the real pressure today is to make sure that it is applied in practice. And for that, we are seeing some great examples around the world where the provisions of the convention, where its principles are given, respected, but we are also seeing a great test where there have been attempts to undermine or circumvent the convention and its provisions.
Marianna, let me ask you, do you think, from your perspective, that the UN Refugee Convention needs updating? Do the protections that are offered need to be expanded? And is there enough political will to even do something like that?
So the refugee protection has certainly saved thousands and millions of lives. However, I do think that it's obsolete because it ignores structural violence such as poverty, but it also ignores environmental issues. And as years pass, we are going to see more and more environmental refugees trying to cross from the global south to the global north. However, the biggest problem is not, in my view, the Refugee Convention, it's political will. Because to have a successful convention, you need political will. And in Europe's case, you can see that Europe, and the European Union specifically, is falling short on that.
Nando, I want to quote from a piece that you wrote recently about what's going on at the Poland-Belarus border. You said, while understanding the geopolitics behind the current border crisis is useful and relevant, the protection of vulnerable people stranded at the EU border and their humanitarian needs should remain paramount, as well as their right to claim asylum. This idea of people being stuck there in the middle of this geopolitical row that's going on, has that all gotten lost in this?
It's, I mean, to many ways, it's nothing new what's happening. I mean, we have seen it is escalating as a tactics that we've seen applied also elsewhere. You know, the weaponization of refugees and forced displacement, the use of civilians as a human shield. So this is why we need a UN convention. We need the protection of human rights of civilians, of people that are suffering persecutions and violence, etc. The point, my reading of what's going on now at the border between Belarus and Poland is clearly a border crisis, which has got its own sort of various geopolitical agenda that overlap with each other, in which the people are just forgotten in the middle. They're actually not just forgotten, they are really used to achieve other goals. Your question about, well, do we need a new UN convention? The point is while the two may not be working always as well as we would like, in the current political climate, if we were going to negotiate a convention like the Geneva Convention, you will not get that level of protections. I mean, this is something that a lot of people are well aware of. This is why despite the call for improving the accountability of party, etc., it's really difficult to imagine that there is enough political will to create another tool which is more effective in protecting people. I mean, it seems like that states don't really want to do it.
Shabia, pinned to the top of your Twitter account are these words: "Just your daily reminder that seeking asylum is not illegal. The right to seek asylum is a fundamental right." So let me ask you, how disturbing is it to you that more and more countries seem to continue to frame this idea that people seeking asylum is something that is not legal?
Indeed, I think it's a very, very worrying trend, but I think we also have to put things into perspective. The great majority of states in many countries around the world are respecting refugee rights. They're enabling people who seek safety to cross into their territory. In some cases, they ensure that they're included in national health systems, education, and are able to work. So you have some really good examples of what's happening. And at the same time, we have to remember 90% of the world's refugees today, they're not hosted in the global north. They're actually in developing regions. So we're seeing also a very disproportionate response, really inflammatory rhetoric, fear-mongering about refugees, which is really unhelpful. And at the same time, this really dangerous narrative that's trying to disrespect the rights that refugees have. These are people who don't actually want to flee. They're being driven out of their homes because their lives are in peril. They're fleeing conflict, violence, persecution on the basis of their identity. So we're talking about a very small fraction of people, and the response and the narrative around that is just completely overwhelmed and disproportionate in terms of the rights that they have under law, but also the reality of actually where they're fleeing to and the situation today in the world.
Nando, I saw you nodding along to some of what Shabia was saying there. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I think that something we're observing at the moment is this idea that the right to claim asylum is denied even at an early stage when we basically portray to represent, we talked about the people at the border as illegal migrants, for example. So the use of the terms, the vocabulary is very important. If you look at the way that Belarus and Poland, for example, are referring to the people caught in the middle of this border crisis, Poland will be, and European Union are very careful not to talk about asylum seekers or refugees. They always talk about illegal migrants or just migrants. While Belarus is talking about refugees, in a sense, is trying to make a point that the European Union is breaching their own human rights obligation, etc. So the language is important, and the right to claim asylum is a fundamental one that we really need to make a lot of efforts to ensure is retained in the current crisis and in general.
Marianna, I saw you just reacting right now to what Nando was saying. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, basically, as Nando said, it's important to pay attention to language. And we have seen that throughout the years that the narrative on refugees and migrants has changed. And what is happening in Poland is not something new. It happened in Greece 2015, 2016. It happened again 2020, and now it's happening in Poland. But the main thing that I want to focus on is that once the media attention stops, what happens then and what happens to those people and those people who will be trying to cross, because the movement will not stop. But will Europe and the European Union be open to receiving them and respecting the UN Refugee Convention?
Shabia, Marianna there was talking about the fact that it's, this migration is not going to stop. And I want to bring up these latest numbers from the UN Refugee Agency when it comes to global displacement. It's talking about 84 million, actually in excess of 84 million people. This is the number of refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced as more people around the world fled violence, insecurity, and the effects of climate change in the first half of 2021. These numbers are staggering. Do you expect that these numbers, that the number of cases of people trying to flee disasters and violence are only going to grow in the years ahead?
Well, most of the numbers that you've read out, Mohammed, actually, most of those people that have been forcibly displaced or forced to flee their homes are actually hosted within their own countries. So they haven't crossed international borders, but they've been forced to flee for safety. So they're what we call internally displaced people. And then we are talking about more than 20 million refugees who have crossed international borders, who've sought safety, but 90% of them, so 9 out of 10 of those people are hosted in developing countries. They're not in Europe, they're not in the global north, they're largely and overwhelmingly within what we would call the global south. So that has to be borne in mind when we have these discussions, because the facts and the narratives get twisted and distorted, and then it paints a very worrying picture, and then it adds into this scaremongering. So the fact is that most of the strain in hosting or responding to refugee crisis, it's borne by developing countries. And that's why there was a key international framework that was agreed to, the Global Compact, which for refugees, which was very cognizant of this inequity in the global response. But in answer to your question, are the numbers going to increase? Yes, we've been seeing that on a yearly basis, that they are increasing. And this is a result of a lack of political will and commitment to resolve the crises that cause people to flee, because they're fleeing conflict, they're fleeing insecurity, but we're seeing conflicts around the world, they continue because of a lack of political resolution. So we have been calling for quite some time that this response to these crises requires global coordinated action to end the root causes that force people to flee their homes in the first place.
Marianna, Shabia there mentioned the Global Compact on Refugees. That was adopted in December 2018. It called for the international community to work together to improve the self-reliance of refugees, among other things. But this Global Compact on refugees, it's not legally binding. So I'm curious, from your perspective, can it truly offer solutions?
Some minor solutions, certainly. However, unless the global north and specifically the West respects it, nothing is going to change. And from what we're seeing in Greece specifically, they're not respecting binding or non-binding documents. In Greece, it's quite clear that the Greek government, with the knowledge of the European Union, is violating international law, and this has been clearly documented. But nothing is happening. So I don't think that many things will change, because there is no political will from no one.
Nando, let me ask you a version of the same question. From your perspective, what kinds of protections do you see that the Global Compact on Refugees could potentially offer?
I mean, the impetus to develop these tools came from the 2015 and 16 refugee crisis. There was this idea that there was a global refugee crisis and people had to come together. During the work of preparations, initial decision was to develop a single global compact that then was split in two, one sort of focus on migrants and the other one on refugees. The element that is important here, and is actually somehow relevant for the current crisis, I think, is this idea that a lot of effort have been put in mobilizing people in so-called country of transit. Is to get countries to do more in terms of protecting the rights of the people on the move, facilitating, for example, access to rights, labor, etc., in so-called transit country, to ensure that they basically don't do the next step as well. So there is protecting the right on one end, but also as part of this tool, there is clearly also a migration control agenda, which is behind it, under them. And I've been involved in some of the negotiations, and I've listened to how different countries were responding to it. So that's why I'm sort of there is an ambiguity in these tools. Can I just also add something about the numbers you mentioned before? Is the number of 80 million, the 20 million, over 20 million refugees, etc. But one thing we should not mistake is the fact that those are stock number, which means this is the total of all refugees in the world at this point. This is maybe even people that moved 20 years ago. So this is not, and it's important because sometimes, especially in the unsympathetic media, we see this figure very much used as to create an idea of invasion going on. I mean, the number of people that move every single year is much smaller. I mean, if you look at the flow of people seeking protection and refugees. So we need to be careful not to conflate. Also because if you think in terms of what kind of problems are there, in terms of how to promote integration, settlement, peaceful living together, there are some issues that come when a new population comes in a country, and others that come when the population has been there, refugee for 30 years in the country. So it's slightly different, significantly different issues as well.
Shabia, let me pick up on something Nando was referring to. There are narratives out there. There are narratives out there, politicians especially in many countries where they attempt to demonize migrants and refugees. We see that more and more the last several years. And I'm curious about, from your perspective, and from the perspective of the UN Refugee Agency, I mean, what can be done to counter that?
Indeed, we're seeing some really worrying narratives and toxic rhetoric out there. It dehumanizes people at the end of the day. I mean, even when we talk about the numbers, these are human lives. They're people who are entitled to benefit from the protections and the human rights that everyone else does. But they're kind of reduced to really to political narratives used for elections or for other kind of campaigning and fear-mongering. So it's really important for the narratives to be countered with the truth. If you look at the numbers as we were talking about, we're dealing with a very, very small amount of people that are seeking international protection. This is not something that's overwhelming, and this can really be managed when there are proper asylum systems in place that are expedient and efficient and fair, and they can actually screen out people that do need protection and those that don't. So it's a really manageable problem, and what helps is really just, as I mentioned, countering those narratives. I mean, the work of the media, yourself, Mohammed, but also, I mean, broadcasters, media, academics, everyone has a role to play, and I think the Global Compact on Refugees also falls on that and having a whole of society approach to respond to refugee crisis. But it's important that everyone's on board in tackling this and being able to manage the situation, but also just ensuring that at the end of the day, it's a very humane approach where we remember that these are people we're talking about. They shouldn't be instrumentalized and reduced and dehumanized.
Marianna, I want to look again for a moment towards the Poland-Belarus border, because there is a new law in Poland. Polish security forces can use force to keep migrants from entry. Human rights advocates have decried this policy and said that it is illegal under international law. Is that the case? Is it illegal?
I think it is illegal, even though I'm not a legal expert, but people have the right to seek asylum. And when this right is denied, then something is wrong. And we've been seeing it throughout Europe. People are being denied the right to seek asylum throughout the European Union, and this is a major issue. And for me, as I said earlier, the biggest thing would be to see what is going to happen in the Belarusian and Polish border once the media attention is away. Because when this happened to Greece, then Greece continued to push back people illegally and denying their right to seek asylum. So I have a feeling that something similar is going to happen in Poland. And Poland has an authoritarian government, and this is a fact.
Nando, the European migration crisis in 2015 and 2016 seemed to shock the international community, and a lot of countries said that they were going to redouble their efforts to come up with cohesive and humane solutions, and yet that didn't happen. Why is that the case? Are we ever going to see some kind of cohesive, coherent policy from the EU when it comes to migration, when it comes to refugees?
I think there is clearly the issue of solidarity among European member states in the context of asylum is an issue. I mean, we have seen it in the previous refugee crisis, but in many ways there has been many years before, since at least a decade earlier, there's been an attempt to harmonize the approach to the right to asylum and the asylum process within the European Union, with a lot of resistance by different member states. You know, this idea that we should, I mean, they use I don't particularly like as an expression is like the no burden sharing. You know, this idea that the European as a whole has to address the asylum applications, and so each member state should contribute somehow, either economically or providing shelter and protection to people that apply. What we saw with the refugee crisis 2015-16 is that while there was a solidarity mechanism in place, which was meant to facilitate the movement of asylum seekers from the southern states, Italy and Greece in particular, and Malta, it took a huge effort to really manage to do it. I mean, to get other countries to accept people that had applied for asylum in the border states. In particular, some groups like the Visegrad group, the Central Eastern European member states, they always resist any call for doing more in terms of taking responsibility for the asylum seeker. Now, somehow what we're seeing is that actually it's that border that is under pressure. And this is even more than a challenge to European solidarity, because countries like Italy or Greece, they're really thinking about, well, is it now our time to do something? I mean, if they ask for help, should we do it? As nothing got done in 2015 and 16 when we were asking for support, for example.
Shabia, in 2015 and 2016, I was covering the migration crisis in many different parts of Europe, and I was really shocked by what I saw. I met a woman from Iraq named Suha, and her 2-month-old baby named Rawan. And I first came across her as she was trying to enter Hungary, and then I came across her a few days later on Croatia's border with Slovenia. And she and her daughter, she was just trying to get to Germany to be reunited with her husband. She couldn't understand how, having come from a place so violent, that people in Europe would not allow her to just get to her husband. It was something that was really heartbreaking. And I'm curious about what seems to be a collective loss of empathy these days when it comes to the rhetoric around refugees and migrants. And do you think that the politics of today are so devoid of empathy that the belief in human rights for all has diminished so much?
Well, we really hope that won't be the case. I mean, we are seeing some very noisy narratives for sure that are devoid of empathy and dehumanizing. But at the same time, it is a very mixed global picture. We're also seeing some amazing expressions of solidarity and compassion, including in frontline states and countries in the global south where they are receiving refugees. Even at the height of the pandemic, when many borders around the world were closed, there were a number of countries that were still making sure that they abided by their international legal obligations. They accepted refugees. And even today, we see the countries that have maybe the fewest resources to deal with these refugee movements, and they're the ones that are hosting the vast majority of refugees. So that is very encouraging. It is a very mixed global picture, and we hope that we see these expressions of solidarity and compassion and adherence to legal obligations that they are extended. But the stories that you mentioned, Mohammed, we see that every day in our work all over the world. People are just fleeing these horrendous circumstances, trying to save their lives and that of their families. And this is why the Refugee Convention is so important. And it is also important to spotlight the stories where we do see best practice and we see great examples of this being extended, these protections being extended to refugees. So it's important to have that focus, but to encourage good practice and adherence more than anything.
All right, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests today, Shabia, Mantoo, Nando, Sigona, and Marianna Karakoulaki. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.